I don't think he needs an introduction, but he is one of the foremost African American and just foremost political strategists for progressive politics, and he has been doing thinking, of course, over the course of this midterm election period about the implications for African Americans and other communities of color. So we wanted to round out the conversation today about solutions with a real analysis of what we're dealing with politically. So please join me in recognizing Cornell Belcher.
Thank you. Where's the presentation going to be? Oh, it's up there? Okay, I got it. Great. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it. I'm actually, basically haven't gotten much sleep. I was on television most of last night. Want to go over a couple of things. We're still unfolding the conversation, still talking about getting into the data and looking at some details of the exit polling. But first, let's put it in context. And this is not an excuse. Dems got their asses whipped. But it was predictable. To a certain extent, we could have done some things differently to try to push back the wave. One is the context. Historically, whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, second term of a president, midterm second term of a president, you're going to lose seats. Average loss, 29 seats. You're going to lose seats. That's what history. So we had history against them. Democrats had history against them. They also had geography. There are 3 Senate class maps. 2 of those Senate class maps aggregate the president won the battleground states in. This one aggregate, he did not win the battleground states in. This Senate class map was in fact through the heart of Republican territory, through the heart of the South. That didn't bode well. The third thing is demographics. Typically, midterm elections are composed of an older, let's say, less diverse electorate than the general electorate. Older, less diverse electorate that tends, not to be very favorable towards Democrats. That's the context. The other point I want to make here is, and I'll make this a point and I'll circle back around to it, is there was a lot of conversation going into election about how the president was unpopular, how wildly unpopular the president is, and that was a narrative that Republicans ran with, and Democrats actually helped them run. The media actually helped them run with it. 45% approval right now is not great. But given the context when Congress's approval is 13, it's pretty good. And once upon a time, actually, up until '94, members with below 50% job approval were in real trouble. As the electorate has grown more cynical about politics and politicians, that has become less and less true, where you have politicians winning without majority job approval. Senator, the former majority leader was one that in his state that didn't have majority job approval, but won handedly. So the context is, the president's job approval numbers weren't great, but they were a lot better than the overall context of the other political actors. And guess what? If the president's job approval number was 51, 52, 53% approval, that would mean absolutely nothing in, say, Kentucky, or a lot of these solidly red states that where you're never going to see much of a wave or enthusiasm for a Democrat candidate. Now, the historical context of the president's job approval, just to sort of talk about where we are. Look, when you look at Reagan's job approval at this point, and Clinton's job approval at this point, there was never more than 17-point gap, 13-point gap between the congressional job approval, Congress's job approval, and the president's job approval. They kind of go hand in hand. They don't go wildly away from each other. This is the first time where you see that gap really opening up, where you got a better than 20-point gap between the presidents, where people are with the president and where people are with Congress. So you're going with a wildly unpopular Congress. Through the heart of much of Republican territory, and I'll talk a little bit about the battlegrounds. Look, guess what, people? Virginia is still a battleground. Colorado is still a battleground. Iowa is still a battleground. There's reasons why those were battleground states, because they flip back and forth. There's been a lot of talk about the minority vote in this election, going into this election. The point I want to make this afternoon is that the blame for what happened yesterday cannot be laid at the feet of minority voters. And I can't put too fine a point on that. Because when you look at the data from up there, and that, by the way, I can barely see that. But when you look at the data from up there, what you see is, in fact, that minority voting as a proportion of the electorate actually increased from 2010. We knew going into this election cycle that we could not have the 2010 electorate again, or you're going to lose. Overall, the proportion of the electorate was more minority, and particularly in certain states. And even when you look at states like Kentucky, there, where you know what the problems we had in Kentucky there, you actually had African Americans increasing as a proportion of the electorate there, even in a state like Kentucky. African Americans got the joke. They were sophisticated voters, put that aside, and as a portion of the overall electorate increased. The same is true with Florida. As you can see, the proportion overall increased. Now, was it 2012 increase or 2008 increase? No. But was a larger portion of the electorate minority? Yes, it was, particularly in key battleground states. Here is what's a lot more problematic. There's two things that are still really problematic. One is, look at the senior number. And this is what I was talking about, older electorate. In 2012, a larger swath of our electorate were younger voters and older voters. That's a really big deal in an election for progressives. A larger swath of our electorate were younger voters and seniors. This time around, that wasn't close to being true. Flip the graph, please. And a lot of talk has been about the Latino vote and the frustration about immigration reform, and so you would expect to see a huge drop-off in Latino voters as well this time around. Well, the truth of the matter is, when you look at key states like Florida, where that Latino vote was critical, actually small improvements over what it was in 2010. So from a blanket statement, and I know there's going to be a lot of media trying to lay this blame at the feet of minority voters. The numbers don't say that you lay this at the foot of minority voters. That's too simple a narrative. Flip to the next graph. This is the fundamental problem, not of just this election. This is perhaps the fundamental problem of American history. Did Democrats make mistakes in this cycle? To me, there were two big glaring problems that Democrats had this cycle. One was solvable, perhaps. One was not. When you get into some of these states, into some of these numbers, it gets more daunting. And I want you all to study that. I could teach a couple of weeks course just on that graph alone. It's a percentage of whites voting Democrat. You'll notice that Democrats haven't won white voters since LBJ signed the civil rights legislation. Again, I want you to understand, Democrats have not won white voters since LBJ signed the civil rights legislation. Democrats have typically done well when they won 41, 45, 46% of the electorate of white votes. Again, not a majority. You would think that since we're post-racial now, that we'd actually be winning more white voters. But the truth of the matter is we're winning less. What Barack Obama got, quite frankly, in 2012 among white voters would have handed him a tail whooping, a decade and a half ago because of the demographics. Mitt Romney got the Reagan coalition, the landslide Reagan coalition. This has not been improving. Now, I'll circle back around to this. In a memo that I did for the party was leaked to the New York Times a couple weeks ago. And part of it talked about the base not being as well positioned as it should be. When you get into the, I'm gonna get in the weeds for you guys. When you look at the precincts in the battleground states, what has been happening in midterm elections is this. When you look at base Republican precincts, those 65 plus performing precincts, meaning that they've been voting 65% or better for one party or the other, there's been a 17-point drop-off between Democratic-based precincts and Republican-based precincts. We've got to stop that drop-off, all right? It's hard to win an election if we don't stop that drop-off. That was a turnout problem. That was the fundamental turnout problem. Now, I can argue that when you look at how minorities increase their proportion of the electorate modestly, that some of that was solved for. But this is what you can't solve for. In Georgia, really well-financed Senate campaign, I would argue a pretty good, doggone good candidate with one of the most respectable names in Georgia, Michelle Nunn. Anyone want to guess what she lost white voters by? 12 points? If she had lost white voters by 12 points, she'd be senator. She lost white voters in Georgia by 51 points. She lost white women in Georgia by 42 points. That's the fundamental problem with this election cycle. That's the fundamental problem with much of the politics, and I'm a Southerner, so I can beat up on the South. That's the fundamental problem with much of the politics in the South. In the end, Democrats, we really push women's equity issues. And we won large, the voters most concerned about women's equity issues. But Obama is scary. And when you tell me that you're a Clinton Democrat, you're parsing it up like that, we Southerners know what that means. And as much as they tried to run from it, that was what we couldn't escape from. 2 minutes? I can wrap this race conversation up in 2 minutes. But this is the fundamental problem that Democrats a little harder to solve for. Should Democrats have let Barack Obama out on the campaign trail more? Absolutely they should. Understanding that he had something to run on. Democrats had something to run for. 3.5 growth. You know what Europe would do to get 3.5 growth? Unemployment back down to where it was pre-recession. Stock market doing real well. Corporations doing real well. Manufacturing jobs, seeing a growth in manufacturing jobs, the likes of which you hadn't seen since the 90s. You know what? You may not like what's going on in the Middle East, but the man said he was going to wind down 2 wars, and you know what he did? He wound down 2 wars and brought troops home like he said he would, and like Americans said they wanted. Peace and prosperity. Reagan would have said this was morning in America. Democrats didn't make their case and they didn't fight for that. Instead, they ran from it. But I understood why they ran from it. because Republicans want the nationalized election. Republicans ran the same election that they did basically in 2012, but this time you had a less diverse electorate, and they ran up the score among white voters. What Democrats couldn't solve for, and it's a longer conversation, is this. This is the problem that has haunted America for quite some time. I mean, this is really the ghost of America's original sin that still haunts us. And if we don't solve for this bifurcation, the future belongs to China and India. Because we're not growing less diverse, we're growing more diverse, and we're growing more racially polarized. This is not a conversation that we like to have, at least like my white liberal friends like to have even. But this is the most important political conversation that we'll have moving into the next decade, is we cannot continue along this racial polarized line, or we're going to tear our country apart. So that's what we really have to solve for. And again, it's bigger than Democrat versus Republican, because this is tribalism, where we're not one tribe, we're two tribes, and people continue to play that card, and we get this result. There's two electorates. One, and they're both fighting for the future of this country. One is a broader, more diverse general electorate you see, it's younger, it's browner. One is a midterm electorate that's older and less diverse. They want to take their country back. They're clear about that. They made the move to take their country back. The next move is yours. Thanks.
Wow. Worth waiting for? Yes. Thank you so much, Cornel.
Thank you.
And if you have time to hang around, maybe there's we can do a little questions. But we are going to formally wrap up the formal part of our program and welcome you to continue the conversation. So it is my pleasure to introduce, provide closing comments. We talked about the new mayor of DC. Wade Henderson is the mayor of the civil rights community in DC. As the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Wade has the task of herding all of the 200 national organizations that are part of the coalition together to work on some of these issues that we've been discussing today, so that we have more power as a group than we do on our own. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Wade to close us out.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Wade Henderson. I head the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And as Chanel Hardy said, the Leadership Conference is really the nation's leading civil and human rights coalition. We have over 200 national organizations, as we say, working to build an America as good as its ideals. I'm proud that the National Urban League is a member of the Leadership Conference. Mark Morial, President Morial, is actually the chair of the Governance Committee at the Leadership Conference. And certainly the work of Chanel Hardy and the work of the National Urban League do much to advance civil and human rights, not just here in Washington, but nationally. I was asked to sort of give you an assessment of where things stood in light of the election results from yesterday. And obviously you've had a full day of activity, and you just heard from one of the most distinguished pollsters in the country, Cornel Belcher. And I told Chanel, I have an upbeat message. I'm going to be very brief, and I'm going to try to bring it home so that you leave this meeting today with a greater sense of your own power to change the circumstances that you and your constituents feel in urban league centers all across the country. First of all, I know that for some of you, the results yesterday were somewhat surprising, perhaps a little dispiriting. I understand that many people had hoped for a different and arguably a better outcome. And so you are perhaps surprised at what occurred yesterday. But for those of us who have lived perhaps a little longer than some of you here in the audience, we've seen this before. Yesterday wasn't a surprise. This was a wave election, not unlike that which we saw in 1994 when the Republican leadership under Newt Gingrich became the head of the House of Representatives, and a series of dramatic changes that affected the Clinton presidency, not necessarily for the better, took effect. So what we saw yesterday was not a big surprise. I would also say that we've seen it historically. 50 years ago, we had an election in which President Lyndon Johnson was on the ballot, running against Senator Barry Goldwater from Arizona. And prior to that election, African Americans had embraced in substantial ways the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. And Democrats, who were then not necessarily seen as the progressive force for change, were some of the people who had been most reactionary with respect to federal legislation dealing with issues like lynching and other interests that we hold dear. So don't get caught up in party labels. Yes, they matter, but the issues of African Americans don't depend on who is in power from one party to the other. Your issues and our interests remain the same no matter who is in control. We want better schools and opportunities that education provides. We want an economy that is responsive to the interests and needs of our people. We want opportunities for growth and development that can only occur if we are fully enrolled in the economy of the day. We have interest to ensure that our votes are both protected, respected, and counted, and that in every election in which we participate, our interests will be adequately protected. The interests that we espouse are not partisan interests, ladies and gentlemen, they're national interests. And we've got to do our best to make sure that no matter who is in power, we are signaling that we are here to deal. And that's just the way it is. So, no applause needed, guys. I'm just telling you, okay? Stand up, recognize that your interests haven't changed, and that while we're going to have to perhaps adapt some strategy and some real thought about what we do and how to pursue that, the goal we have for full participation in a democratic society, as we have come to define it, is the goal at hand. So we're going to have to talk about how to make that happen. Now, I want to pick up on something that Cornell Belcher said, because, you know, for some of you who are millennials, I'm looking out in the audience. Not everybody here has gray hair like me. There are a few of you out here who are quite young, quite vibrant. You're indicating your claim to millennial status. Millennials didn't turn out in big numbers yesterday. They did not turn out in big numbers. And they didn't turn out in big numbers because obviously they didn't see their interests as necessarily being tied to the outcome of the election. And I will say that some of them think that because of the changed circumstances, we now have our first African American president, that we are living in a so-called post-racial world in which race is no longer a significant factor. God knows I wish that were true. I really do. The work that I do as a civil rights lawyer is designed to achieve that result. But there are a lot of facts that have come to the table that belie that rosy picture of the world. Even President Obama, while he doesn't openly espouse that view, has clearly indicated a discomfort in being characterized as, quote, the black president of the United States. He wants to be and is the 44th president of the United States, and he wants to be respected for his substance and his political acumen and his commitment to change. And all of that is true. But for those of you who think that race doesn't matter, that race is not a factor in the world in which we function, I think you're being somewhat naive. And I think the facts that I'm going to lay out will give you an example. So I'll only deal with one. You know, on the night that President Obama had his inaugural balls, I think it was around January 2009, January 8th, 2009, on the night of the president's inaugural balls, there was a dinner held in Washington. The dinner was organized by Eric Cantor, the former majority leader in the House of Representatives. It was organized by Kevin McCarthy, the congressman from California who replaced Eric Cantor when he was ousted. It was organized by Paul Ryan, the new wonderkin of the sort of restrictionist economy. It was organized by Newt Gingrich. There were many in attendance who were business people here in the country. And the purpose of the dinner was to chart a course of action that Republicans could use to regain power. There's nothing wrong with that conversation at all. You would expect a conversation like that to take place. But another element of that meeting, of that dinner, was how this cabal of individuals and the constituents and organizations they represented, how they would come together to actually work to demonize this president as a way of creating obstruction and disunity that could lead to his political defeat. It was one of the first times that a party had expressed interest in using obstruction not just as a tactic, but as a way of actually guaranteeing that the President of the United States would not be able to legitimately hold office and make change. Now, why do I say that this is one of the few times that that has been done? Well, some of you may remember there were a lot of issues that have been debated over the last 6 years of the Obama presidency. But the one that really underscores how obstruction trumped, partisan interest trumped national interest was the way in which the debt ceiling of 2008-2010 was being used. Now, some of you don't even remember the debt ceiling. I barely remember it myself, and I worked on the issue, okay? But the debt ceiling, you may recall, was that automatic increase of the country's ability to borrow money so that we could continue to pay our bills, and it was considered basically an automatic gesture by members of Congress. In this instance, Republicans blocked the ability of the president to raise the debt ceiling and did so at the cost of the interest rate that the federal government paid globally. And it sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but at the end of the day, we ended up hurting our economic status in the world. And we did it to advance partisan interests. It's one of the few times that the economic interests of the country overall were trumped by somebody's desire to make a partisan gain in pursuing partisan politics. I'm mentioning this because that dinner that I referred to in January of 2009, and a lot that has happened since then, reflects the fact that the president's racial dynamic, the fact that he is the first African-American president, has been a subtle factor. It's not overt, not being hammered against anyone in a way that would allow you to say, oh, what a racist gesture. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about the subtle manipulation of facts to enjoy a particular purpose. So on the one hand, race was a factor. On the other hand, you've got Democrats running scared from their own president. You had Democrats who were running for office who determined that, well, the best way for me to win is to put some distance between myself and this president. And they did things that were totally counterproductive. I heard people like some of the, I won't name names, but some of the women candidates who were running for Senate didn't talk about the health care bill, didn't talk about the role that health care played in the lives of women. Let me give you one example. I was shocked to discover this when I worked on the health care bill. Do you know that being a victim of domestic violence, if you are a woman who is a victim of domestic violence, that was previously considered a condition that would not allow you to extend your health care services under another insurance carrier, that it was considered a previous condition of disability. if you were a victim of domestic violence. In other words, if you were a woman who was being beaten at home, that was considered a pre-existing condition that blocked you from getting health care insurance from another carrier. Now, what kind of world are we talking about? That's insane. And yet you didn't hear a lot of women talking about the role that health care played in the domestic violence protection of women. You didn't hear people talking about how their 24-year-old son was carried on their insurance policy, or how expanding Medicaid made a difference in the lives of the poor. So you had Democrats turning away from their own leadership. And then lastly, you had an inept, and I have to say this, I mean, I love President Obama. I think he's done well. But you had an inept set of messages coming from the White House. And all three of those factors conspired together to produce the outcome that we saw in yesterday's election. Now, the question is, okay, you saw that, so what? What are we supposed to do about it? Well, guys, let me say this. Our interests depend on our ability to bring the vote to the table. If you don't vote, you don't count. Voting is the language of democracy. If you don't vote, you don't count. Now, black voters turned out yesterday at much higher numbers, and you will see that in the coming days ahead, than some people think. Cornell Belcher did a good job in helping to identify pockets of black votes that needed to be mined for a strong production, and he did a good job. But you know, it's not enough. We need progressive votes in general, and we need to do a better job. So I'm going to give you three quick issues, and then we're going to bring this to an end, and this is why it's important. First, this election was the first election in 50 years that was conducted without the Voting Rights Act being in place. This is the first election in 50 years without the meaningful protection of the Voting Rights Act. And what did that mean? There were incidents all over the country. 40,000 lost votes in Georgia. People not being protected when they go to the polls. Now, civil rights groups did a great job. They set up something called election protection. They documented 18,000 calls from around the country yesterday of people complaining about voter registration, the lack of ID, the ability to get their votes counted. Bottom line is we ended up leaving too many votes on the table. We have an obligation to turn that around, and that's on us, and we can do it. Republicans and Democrats support the values of a Voting Rights Act, and our job has got to be to deliver those votes. And I don't want to hear that, well, Republicans are in control. How do you expect them to do what we haven't been able to get Democrats to do? Well, that's a good question. But you start by talking with them. How do you get Republican support? You talk to Republicans. There are too many of us that are intimidated by that process. You see yourselves as being in the pockets of Democrats, and you don't talk to Republicans, and that's crazy. Chanel Hardy, on behalf of the Urban League, does a good job in reaching out to Republicans, as does Mark Morial. And anybody who wants to win in Washington recognizes that the votes of Democrats are never enough to carry you over the threshold. So you need the votes of both parties. It's our job to make that happen. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If we can't get a Voting Rights Act passed, shame on us. That speaks to our ability to deliver political power when it counts. And I know every one of you understands what I'm saying. So the Voting Rights Act is number one on our hit parade. Secondly, we have a chance to make significant progress in criminal justice reform. In every community around the country, too many brothers, and they're largely brothers, too many brothers and black women, increasingly, are being incarcerated in systems where they don't need to serve time. And we should be really working to limit the problem of mass incarceration. The good news is that the Justice Department wants to work with us. Eric Holder, by the way, has been fantastic. And if you think he's been as good as I think he is, let's give it up for Eric Holder, because I think he has been a wonderful Attorney General. He's fighting to make change, but he can't do it on his own. He's announced that he's leaving. There's certain things that have to be changed before he leaves. We can make that happen, and the National Urban League has a priority of making that happen. So we're going to do that. Thirdly, education reform. Guys, education is not a federal issue, it's a state issue, a state and local issue. We have 50 different education systems, none of which are delivering effectively for our kids, none of which are delivering effectively. We can make a difference. And the Urban League has a particular set of unique political skills that can deliver and make a significant difference here. And we need Urban League chapters and affiliates speaking up on important education issues at the local level. And if you do it, it'll make a difference. And then last but not least, guys, we need help in resolving this economic inequality and the gulf between those with resources, the haves, and those without resources, the have-nots. Too many of the constituencies that the Urban League serves are in the have-not category. You don't have resources, you don't have jobs, you're not skilled for the positions that are available today. And that's not going to suddenly happen because you want it to happen. We got to make it happen. Now, all of this is to say, guys, our agenda is a very real agenda. It's an agenda that speaks to the people who we serve every day, that the Urban League serves every day. I just want to say one thing. When you start crying about where we are today and the results of the election, you think back 150 years ago, or really, 150 years ago, when the Civil War was coming to an end, and newly freed black slaves, African-American slaves, were being sent on their own with no resources, no education, no housing, no nothing. And they were forced to make a way where there was no way. And because of their fortitude, because of their commitment, we stand on their shoulders. We have success that they never dreamed possible. And it was made possible because of what they did. So, when you start thinking about the future, just remember, you walk across floors you never scrubbed. You walk through doors you never opened. You have an obligation. To do that on behalf of those who come behind. If we drop the ball in making that possible for those who come behind us, then we will have abdicated our responsibility to pass the baton in the way that helps advance the cause that we all share together. And a setback like the election of last night should really be something that inspires us to go forward and to produce change, not to cry about what we didn't get, but to inspire us to do better going forward. I'm confident that the Urban League brings that kind of perspective to the table. I'm confident that we will deliver going forward. And this message that I'm bringing today is a message of optimism, not a message of defeat. It's a message that says we have the ability to deliver, and we have to bring it. So I want to thank you for sticking around. I want to thank you for participating in this program. And I really want to thank our friend Chanel Hardy and the Urban League for doing such a great job. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Wade. I have nothing I can add. So just join me in recognizing Wade, all of our wonderful panelists, moderators, the staff of the National Urban League Washington Bureau, and all of you for sticking with us today. Thank you.